Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Global Interdependence Center Executive Briefing. I'm Bill Kennedy. I'll be your host today. This is the fifth in our series titled Analyzing Pandemics. Today, we're going to take you inside the Beltway of Washington, D.C. We're going to discuss policy. We're going to talk about energy policy, maybe a little bit about utility policy, but also fiscal, monetary policy. Time permitting, we may talk about the November elections. So it should be a great program. As a reminder, this will be recorded and posted on the GIC's website. That's at www.interdependence.org. Let's get started with our audience survey questions. We have 3 quick questions we'd like you to respond. Take just a couple of seconds to read the question, and then you can use your cursor to select your answer. So our first question today: the world is globally interdependent. In 2 years' time, will we be more interdependent or less interdependent? Next question. This has to do with when you expect the end to social distancing and business closures. Is that in the May-June timeframe, July-August timeframe, fourth quarter of this year, or first quarter of next year? And our final question: when do you think people will be comfortable getting back on an airplane or going to a restaurant? And you can select your time frame there. Great. Thank you, everybody. We'll show the results of the survey questions at the end of the program. But right now, let me introduce our special guest speaker today. This is Mr. James Lucier from Capital Alpha Partners. Capital Alpha is a leading independent provider of strategic policy research based in Washington, D.C. They do policy research as well as political forecasting. Jim is a managing director there. He is responsible for the energy, environmental, and tax practices for the firm. He brings several decades of experience in the oil and gas industry, power and utility, as well as alternative energy. And Jim spends his time providing predictive and insightful analytics to his clients, which he's going to share with us today at the GIC. So with that, Jim, we welcome you to the executive briefing. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Bill. I am very happy to be here. You gave me a long, wonderful introduction, but the reality is that I just have a very interesting job, which entails telling all sorts of interesting stories. I like to sit around and ask myself, why is this happening, and what makes the world this particular way? And while the official topic does have to do with energy and utilities, what I'll really be doing is talking about the broad policy response that Washington makes to the COVID-19 crisis. And certainly that will have some impact on oil and renewable energy and electricity that we'll get to. But the fiscal story is really what we're talking about, because we are looking at adding roughly $6 trillion to the federal debt by the time this crisis is over, indeed possibly by the time this year is over. So we may be looking at a debt to GDP ratio of 116% by the year 2030, which is about 10 years earlier than we would have expected to reach it otherwise. So anyway, thanks very much to the GIC for sponsoring this event. I've come to many GIC events as a participant, and I've always found them very, very interesting. I found the questions and the frankly, the very informed commentary that we get from our participants to be the best part of the event, and I really look forward to that. So Colleen, maybe you could back up and just go to our top slide here. So there's a lot to talk about today. I'm going to open with some comments on streaming media and what streaming media means for energy consumption. I think that may startle you a bit, but it'll tell you a little bit about what's going on with electric power as well. In fact, Colleen, why don't we look at these right now? Let's go to our first slide. Last year, a music video set an all-time record. The very catchy, peppy tune Despacito was the first YouTube video ever seen by 5 billion people. Or should I say there were 5 billion views. According to Fortune magazine, this consumed as much energy as all of the energy used by 40,000 homes in the United States every year. So we may think that we're sitting at home and really conserving energy, not doing very much, but in fact, our use of the internet is actually contributing to tremendous energy use. So if you go forward to our next slide, Colleen. A lot of us are sitting around watching YouTube at home or Netflix or other streaming services. And so it's an interesting exercise to look at the amount of energy it takes to store online videos and transmit them and display them on screens. So if you think in terms of Netflix top movies, we've got a list of them here. Bird Box. You know, people watching this movie, Bird Box, which I haven't seen, have used energy equivalent to 147 million miles driving a car. Or if we go to the next one, Colleen. Actually, that's not the next one, but we can just stop there, actually. Um, the point I was going to make about electric consumption is that the electric grid itself, which we rely on, is a tremendous consumer, a voracious consumer of energy. The data centers in the United States, which support the internet, which are heavily clustered in my hometown of Leesburg, Virginia, and Loudoun County, those internet servers actually use as much power as literally all of the homes in the United States. Your handheld device, for instance, your iPhone, uses as much power in a year as a refrigerator. If you're watching this on an iPad, you're using a device that probably uses even more power. But what's more, given the servers that need to store on-demand video, the servers that transmit those videos, the telecommunications infrastructure for landline and wireless communications, the power that your cell phone uses is actually 1% of the total power that it takes to deliver this video to you. In fact, watching 1 hour of streaming video uses electricity that is roughly the same as you would consume as your share of the total load in a subway car going from Farragut North in Washington to the US Capitol, or frankly, from the White House to the US Capitol. You know, your share of the electricity that moved a subway car 2 miles is about what you're using when you're doing streaming media. So that gives you a little indication of the relative status of the oil and electricity industries. What I'm going to do next, and we can actually take down the slides, Colleen, if you'd like, I'm going to talk a little bit about the outlook for electricity and oil. Then I'm going to focus on the COVID response, what bills are coming up, and also, what this means in terms of the fiscal impact. I'll also talk about the Federal Reserve's lending program and how the Federal Reserve is intervening in the debt markets right now. So let's start with the idea of electricity. I opened with these comments about the consumption of electricity used by the internet and by streaming media to show that by staying home, we really haven't reduced our consumption of electric power by that much. In fact, even though the economy is in lockdown, the reality is that power consumption is only down by about 7%. Important things have changed. The pattern of power demand is different. So we don't have the usual demand of peak power during the day when everyone's at work. It's more evenly spread out throughout the day because those people who are fortunate to stay home are staying home. But in general, electricity consumption has been relatively stable. This doesn't mean that the world is trouble-free for utilities. Power consumption is down a bit after all. You do have to worry about whether people can pay their utility bills. staffing the electric power facilities is a problem. People are literally living inside of power plants to make sure that somebody who is quarantined and COVID free is there to keep the lights on for you. But in general, the electric power industry is weathering the storm pretty well. It's a very different situation for the global oil markets. And in part, the problem here is a real misalignment of supply and demand. Before the COVID crisis started, the world was oversupplied with oil. And you know, Saudi Arabia and Russia chose a very unfortunate time to begin a price war when they were both going to produce even more oil than the world could absorb. And yet, because of the COVID crisis, the global demand for oil has dropped. It's dropped as much as 30%, as much as 30 million barrels a day. A good round number is that the world consumes about 100 million barrels of oil today. So if you see that number drop to, 75 or even 70 million barrels a day, and all of this excess oil coming onto the world market, you can see that prices would have to come down. And what's worse, you have a physical supply problem. There is only a limited amount of storage capacity to store oil once it's been produced. It can be stored in tankers, it can be stored in tank farms, but when the tankers are all full and the tank farms have all hit the tank tops, that means there's no place left for the oil to go. And that's certainly the situation we're seeing globally, but it's particularly acute in Texas. In Cushing, Oklahoma, there is a tank farm which is enormous. It holds about 700 million barrels of oil. Um, that tank farm, excuse me, 90 million barrels of oil, but that tank farm is nearly full. In fact, it will probably fill up next week, which means that unless oil production is cut quickly, there will be no place to store the oil. Because storage was running out last week, we saw oil prices go negative, probably for the first time ever. Oil for May delivery hit negative $37. Right now, oil is trading in the $10 to $20 range, but we could see another wave of negative prices before this crisis is up. And this definitely has made life difficult for the US oil industry. I wouldn't necessarily say the US oil industry is in crisis, but certainly the lack of storage capacity for oil, the inability of the industry, for geological reasons really, to close off all the oil at once, means that the industry is scrambling now. They are scrambling to shut in wells. They are scrambling to find new ways of storing oil. They are scrambling to do whatever they can do to stop this flow of oil, because the reality is that it's very difficult to stop oil production quickly. And that's really where we are right now. Um, Global oil companies like ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, these companies all have access to the global capital markets, and they'll basically be fine. Um, Even the major independent US-based companies, companies like Conoco, or the major US E&P companies, the 15 or 20 best capitalized companies, are also in relatively good shape because during the last major period of low oil prices, they restructured their debt. They were really forced to do a lot of the things they would have to do now in a hurry if they hadn't already been through through a restructuring process already. So it's not really a question of whether the major, largest independent U.S. oil companies will survive. It's really mostly about the smaller independent companies and whether they come through and whether there's any federal government policy that can help them. And the reality is there's probably not a lot of federal government policy that can in fact help them. Um, for Q&A, I might remind Bill to come back and ask me how ultra low interest rates have supported the fracking boom and indeed have supported the oil glut by facilitating oil production when it's really not economic. Now let's talk about the.
So, Jim, if I can just interrupt for 1 minute, I think our audience has lost your video that I just sent you a request
Oh,
online. You should be able to accept that video, and
oh,
we'll.
there we are.
There we go. That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I'll be back for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's terrific. Well, I'll try to wrap this up in another 10 or 15 minutes. So how is Washington coping with the COVID crisis, and what is the tie-in for energy here? So far, Washington has spent over $3 trillion. There have been three bills we call Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3. I was going through the news clips the other day, and I found an amusing article about President Trump saying that he only wanted $2.5 billion in the Phase 1 bill, but he would give Chuck Schumer $8.5 billion if that would make Chuck happy. And that's what happened. The first COVID response bill was mostly just money for public health purposes. It was very small. The second COVID response bill was actually very important for public health because it created paid sick leave for companies that don't offer paid sick leave to their employees. Thus, you could have people that might be sick stay home without coming to the workplace and possibly passing the coronavirus on to their colleagues. There was also in that same package a tax credit to offset the cost of those days of paid sick leave. That first package altogether cost $193 billion. But the big wazoo was CARES Act, the CARES Act, Phase 3. And Phase 3 is officially scored at $2.2 trillion. In fact, the way I added up, it's more than $3 trillion in itself. This bill wound up doing basically just one thing. Certainly there is some public health in there. Certainly there is some money to reimburse hospitals in places like New York City or Washington State or other areas that have been hard hit by COVID. Um, there's also money for the states. But the point of this bill was not so much to support the hospitals, we can do that later, as it was to inject liquidity into the economy. This was not what I would call an economic stimulus bill designed to drive future growth. This was a financial stabilization bill designed to pump liquidity into the economy, which is a very fancy way of making sure that everyone who has a paycheck continues to get a paycheck. We don't have an infrastructure really to deliver individual checks to everyone efficiently. It's much better to give companies loans to keep everyone on the payroll so there's no interruption to the normal status quo. So the bill had an initial tranche of $350 billion of small business loans, which were available for not only small businesses, but nonprofit groups like churches and schools. There was another $454 billion fund for lending to companies in high-stressed industries. But the biggest title was the tax title, which officially was $600 billion of tax relief over 10 years. In fact, it's more like $1 trillion of tax relief front-loaded to the first year and a half. And again, the idea here, which was really a bipartisan idea, but was to keep people on payrolls and to help companies support payrolls just by giving them the equivalent of an unlimited American Express card. So this bill was really all about liquidity. And frankly, the bill moved so quickly that they did not have time to deal with more complicated questions of healthcare policy or of infrastructure, what sort of hospital facilities we need to build in the future. This bill was being done at exactly the same time the Bureau of Labor Statistics was reporting that first in the third week of March, 3.3 million people had lost their jobs. That was a massive record, the biggest ever report. And the next week was even bigger, 6.7 million people filed for unemployment benefits. 10 million people lost jobs in the last 2 weeks of March. So the Phase 3 bill, more than anything else, was a race against time to drive as much money into the economy to make sure that companies could keep payrolls open and also that individual people got money in terms of tax rebates for those who are taxpayers or unemployment insurance for those who are unemployed, and also, of course, food stamp benefits and other types of social support. So in other words, that big bill, really all about people keeping, companies together and giving people the cash they need to put food on the table. The next two bills are going to be big as well. One thing I didn't mention, healthcare coverage. That should be very obvious that we need healthcare coverage, and we need to make sure that people with no job or people who are laid off from work have access to coverage of some kind. That is going to be the principal focus of the next bill, which I call Phase 4. I would like to think that the Phase 4 bill is done before Memorial Day weekend, but it's looking like that timetable will slip because the House of Representatives, which had previously planned to come back next week, will not in fact come back next week. We don't know when they'll come back, but unless they come back soon, meeting that Memorial Day target, not their target, but the target that I have set in my own expectations, it's looking unlikely. Um, in addition to providing health care coverage for people who need coverage, the next big focus for that Phase 4 bill is going to be providing revenue to the states. The last time around, we gave $150 billion to the states just to provide some financial assistance. The problem here is not the expenses that states like New York are running up because of the COVID crisis. The problem is that tax revenues are very dependent on employment and economic activity. So every single state has seen a tremendous revenue shortfall because the economy has slowed down so much. And it's hard to estimate this revenue shortfall, but it's going to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And so the Phase 2 bill is very, very important because not only do we have to get revenue, not only do we have to get money, or not only do we have to get, well, we have to get support money to individuals. We've got to deliver forms of healthcare coverage for individuals. But then there's also this business of making sure the states can continue to meet payrolls for essential services like the police, the fire department, the hospitals themselves, public health, and so forth. So by the time you add this second Phase 2 bill up, it's looking like it could be north of $1 trillion as well. It's going to be very, very large. And again, because the crisis is unfolding quickly, there's not going to be time to do things that there isn't already a fundamental agreement on. There isn't time to do stuff that will take figuring out and planning. It's all about meeting the immediate need right now. Earlier on in the COVID crisis, you had expectations raised once the Democratic Party won a majority in the House of Representatives. They lost no time in proposing a Green New Deal. Earlier this year in February, they fought very hard to get renewable energy tax credits extended as part of the tax extenders bill. They introduced an infrastructure plan that is very heavy on green elements. They also introduced a clean energy standard bill called the Clean Future Act. In other words, they did all of this stuff, and when the COVID crisis was just beginning, the logic was, well, if we're going to spend a lot of money, we might as well do a lot of this Green New Deal stuff as well. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that the amount of money that has been spent so far and that needed to be spent and the speed required in responding means that a lot of the stuff that looked pretty nice, there probably just won't be time to deal with it. There won't be time to sort it out. It's really urgent to get money to New York City now. It is really urgent to figure out what we can do, if anything, to help the state of Illinois with its pension problem. There are many, many, many super urgent demands, and I think there's just no time in Washington for Democrats and Republicans to argue about anything more complicated than writing big checks for the states, making sure hospitals have funding, and making sure we get coverage and maintenance income to people. That leaves us with the fifth bill. This is the infrastructure bill that has been talked about. And again, the crisis itself made it seem like this was a great opportunity to spend lots of money. The reality is that it is to some extent, but it's going to be an infrastructure bill that is more like what we've seen before. The Highway Trust Fund is up for reauthorization this year. It's supposed to be reauthorized by September 30th, probably won't be. But the highway spending, highway construction depends on automobile revenue, gasoline tax revenue. Recall what I just said about gasoline consumption being down by about 30%. Well, tax revenue has dropped too. And don't even ask about the excise tax revenue that supports airports. That's probably gone close to zero. It's very, very minimal. And indeed, as a support to the airline, the federal government has actually temporarily suspended the excise tax in aviation fuel. So what we do next is going to be something with an infrastructure flavor, largely because there's no more time to think about visions for the future. Deal with the highways now, deal with the airports now. Also, of course, the pandemic shows us that our public capital in the United States, the public sector really is not properly equipped to deal with the pandemic. We need surge capacity, we need testing, we need other infrastructure in place. It's wonderful that today's medicine lets you do a hip replacement in a couple of hours. People come in the morning and can leave by early afternoon with 2 new hips and think that, it's wonderful. But because of that surgery that emphasizes treating people on an outpatient basis, we haven't maintained the number of hospital beds that we maintained previously. So I think there's going to be a lot of money for rural hospitals, a lot of money for community health programs, a lot of money for that surge capacity, and maybe also add in some broadband. But the reality is that it's going to look a lot more like the disaster relief bills we saw after Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico. Some green energy components there, some energy efficiency components, pilot programs, demonstration programs, block grants to build new hospitals that are energy efficient, as long as you're building new hospitals anyway. Let's call that one $1 trillion project too. So I said we've done 3 trillion already, another trillion for phase 4, another trillion for phase 5. That gets you 5 trillion, perhaps even 6 trillion by the time you get to infrastructure programs. And what that means is that we're literally adding something close to $5 trillion to the federal debt this year. And the costs are going to continue over time. Under the CBO baseline prior to the COVID crisis, federal debt held by the public had been expected to rise from $17 trillion last year to $30 trillion by 2030. And that would mean that you're increasing the share of debt to GDP from 80% last year to about 98% by 2030, 10 years from now. Under this new scenario, we're looking at debt that reaches 37.2 trillion by 2030, which is 116% of GDP. To give you some comparison, that level of debt has not been seen since World War II, where we had 106% of GDP. So the United States will be carrying an enormous debt burden as a result of this. And one of the things to discuss may be whether in a period of ultra low interest rates we can carry this debt and what the overall implications will be. I'll close a little bit on the Federal Reserve's lending programs. I mentioned earlier that the key focus of policy today has been to do one thing, and that has been to provide liquidity to keep not only individuals and working families afloat, but also the companies that maintain payrolls and that provide maintenance income to most of the US population. The Federal Reserve is not allowed to put its own money at risk. It needs money from Treasury. And Congress gave the Treasury Department $454 billion to use as capital in various lending programs. The Fed has created 9 facilities altogether. Some of them we've seen before, like the famous TALF from the TARP bill, the Term Asset Backed Securities Lending Program. They buy loans from credit cards. They buy securitized debt from automobiles. They basically maintain consumer credit. There are facilities there that will support borrowing by cash-strapped states and municipal governments. And then there's also two new programs, or actually a major new program with several flavors, the Main Street Lending Program. This is for larger businesses that do not qualify for the small business loans. And essentially what happens there is that the Federal Reserve will support credit to these companies by purchasing 95% of each loan, each qualifying loan that the banks make. The limits are relatively small for their for brand new loans, but for companies that are already doing business with a bank where there's an existing credit relationship, the largest program would allow banks to extend up to um, well, the limit is a loan that would take you up to $200 million or 6 times EBITDA of total indebtedness. And this would be a loan that would be deferred for the first year. 70% of it would have to be paid back in year 4. And the point of this is basically to help companies maintain payrolls, but also in heavily levered industries like the auto industry, rent cars, and of course oil. It will be helpful in helping companies that are fundamentally solvent to meet their near-term payments on debt and on loans to avoid defaults. This is important because obviously the fewer defaults you have, the stronger the banking system remains in this crisis, and the more the banks can do to continue providing credit and liquidity to the economy. So final thought on the idea then of a renewable energy for oil deal. I just don't see much prospect of this. The reason is that the sheer volume of oil in the marketplace today is so great. There's nothing the federal government can do to really offset it. So I don't see a grand bargain here. I do think there might be a few smaller renewable energy things that get done at the end of the day, such as making renewable energy tax credits refundable tax credits, and also extending the deadlines for offshore wind facilities that might miss their eligibility for the investment tax credit because they have not finished construction soon enough, and their supply chains bringing needed materials from China were disrupted by the COVID crisis. So I'll stop right there. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but it's always a pleasure to be with you at GIC, even if we have to do it remotely.
Oh, that's great, Jim. Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. I think we're going to get some very interesting questions. Just a reminder to everybody, if you would like to ask a question, from the go-to page, there's a dashboard to the right. You'll find a gray panel titled questions. Open that up. You can type in your question. That will put it into the queue. As we're waiting for the questions to come in, I might ask Colleen if she would take us to our audience survey results so we can see how you answered. Great. So looks like 55% suggesting less interdependent 2 years out. Next. Here it's 36%, which is the largest number for July and August. And I should say that's pretty consistent with what we've seen on prior surveys. And then our third question, when will people be comfortable getting back on an airplane or going to a restaurant? Very interesting. So 45% suggesting not till the first quarter of next year. That's the most of our respondents answered the first quarter of 2021. Great. Thank you everyone for participating in that. So again, questions on the dashboard to the right. And why don't we go ahead and get started, Jim? First question, I'm going to take you to electrical utility topic and theme.
Yeah.
And the question has to do with large scale electrical storage.
Okay.
Where are we in that process? Are there any key or new technologies that are being discussed inside of Washington about the ability to have large scale energy storage going forward?
Yeah, that's really a fundamental and transformational question having to do with the power grid. I'm actually glad you asked me that. And I was actually going to do a different presentation talking about the role of storage in the future. The interesting thing about electricity until quite recently is that you could not store large amounts of electricity in any convenient way. But for those of you who are watching this presentation on your laptop, on your iPad, on your iPhone, well, you're dealing not only with a device that just sucks down energy from the power grid, but you're dealing with mass storage in a way. I mean, there's a huge cloud of devices at the edge of the internet now that provide storage. Imagine all of the storage that comes online too when we have more electric vehicles. So storage is actually beginning to play an important role at the margin right now. And when I say margin, I don't want to be dismissive. Right now, the electric power grid is set up so that we always have some form of generator ready to go, because without storage, you have to have a lot of metal in the ground that is ready to turn on at a moment's notice. And some of the most expensive power providers we have are called peakers, peak plants that cover surges in demand, or they may also cover momentary lapses in the power grid. And very expensive to run those, so they charge very high prices. If we get to a point where you have larger energy storage that is perhaps either part of the distribution level grid, or even behind the meter storage on site, that means there's a lot less demand for peaker plants. Also, because we can store energy in many places, the power demand curve that goes up like a parabola is going to start flattening out over time. And so the prices will change too tremendously. Storage makes it a lot easier to use renewable energy, which tends to be intermittent when the sun is giving you solar power or when you have wind blowing. The different types of storage, talking mostly about battery storage now, hydrogen is probably on the way. At the moment, we are beginning a thorough integration of storage into the grid for the use of peakers in some places, and also what's called ancillary services that help maintain voltage in the grid, maintain frequency regulation, and so forth. As a practical matter, we really only have proven technology that gets us to about a 4-hour block. You can't really run cities on power grids. The total equivalent storage capacity that we have right now is basically the equivalent of 1 gigawatt power plant, and we have about 1,000 of those. So it's relatively small right now, but it doesn't have to be enormous. Simply by existing in small amounts, it could really change the economics of power, and it can change the types of power that we use. The key to this is getting rate recovery, letting companies that invest in this get a regulated rate of return. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission began the process of having a sort of a nationwide framework for utility rate regulation to provide the storage. So we're 1 or 2 years into a process that I think is going to accelerate. One of the things that Congress might do in the COVID bill is provide a tax credit for storage. That would certainly help move it faster. But the reality is that storage is going to become important. At some point, the power grid is going to look like the old General Motors, General Electric, diesel electric rail cars, where you have a combination of storage and generation capacity. So the generation capacity continuously fills the storage, you run off the storage, and you have what is a more effective, stable system over the long run.
Great, thank you for that. This question has to do with energy tax policy.
Yeah.
So 2 areas of expertise for you, and there's a premise which I think is probably accurate, that the fossil fuel tax policy is not equivalent to the renewable energy tax policy. And the question is, when or will those ever be balanced?
Well, the 2 different things here. The fossil fuels get depreciation for the cost of drilling a well, or sort of standard industrial depreciation for their equipment. And that's not likely ever to go away because depreciation applies to everything. Now, what some people are calling for is the production tax credit for wind energy, or an investment tax credit for solar energy. These are on a schedule now, which is due to phase out by 2021 for the lot. And the question is, do you extend it or not? We've had the wind energy tax credit since 1993, and the very originator of it, Chuck Grassley, has argued that maybe it is time to phase out. Wind energy is becoming cost competitive with conventional generation. You can argue, and in fact, in many particular places in the US, depending on the geography, I would argue the Midwest is one. A combination of solar plus storage and wind plus storage may actually be cheaper than building new gas capacity. So we can continue doing ad hoc tax credits indefinitely, or one approach favored by Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, who
Oregon.
is Democratic co-chair, the vice chairman, the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee. He favors going toward a technology neutral tax credit program. Also, if you had some sort of carbon pricing scheme, I mean, that would sort of even out the playing field between different energy sources. So, the answer is this is a very big question that is not going to get sorted out in these very urgent energy bills next year. If we have a Democratic president, if Joe Biden wins the presidential election, and we have a Democratic Senate, we're likely to see the US government, the federal government, move to something that states such as New York and California have done. This is not something that relies on tax credits. It's not something that relies on cap and trade or carbon pricing as such. It's a clean energy target. And I think what we'll see the US government do is just, in effect, set a clean energy mandate that will be the implicit driver for whatever economic development and build out that you need.
Great. All right, I'm going to ask you a series of rapid fire questions regarding the oil patch and the oil industry. First question, true or false? There are 45 to 50 million barrels of oil en route from Saudi Arabia about to hit US shores.
True.
Good. And any implication, I guess that's just more supply that's going to be painful for the price?
Well, where do you put this stuff? I mean, I think the US government recognizes that there is this famous flotilla of Saudi oil coming, which has the capacity of completely overwhelming what little residual storage capacity we have left. We're urging those ships to find somewhere else to go. I think that's really the beginning of the solution to the problem. But the thing about oil is that the flow of oil is not something you can turn off like water flowing into your bathtub. Geologically, it's hard to turn off. You can, in fact, turn it off. You can also stop producing it. One interesting thing that results from today's crisis is that even though we have an excess of oil that has just been supplied, more oil than we can manage, we're shutting oil in. We're going to be losing oil production capacity. And we're not doing the advanced work that we need to do now in order to have oil 1 year, 2 year, 3 years from now. So even though we're in a world of negative oil prices today, we are likely to see oil prices come back in a surprisingly strong way in as little as a year from now, because once we work off the excess supply, we'll actually be short on supply after that.
Okay.
That
So
was
that
a long
actually,
false answer.
that actually answers another question from one of our members. How likely is it that taking capacity offline will lead to supply constraints? And so you're thinking that might be a 12 to 24 month window?
It's probably less than that. Shale oil is oil that comes on with as little as a 6-month advance notice. So there's probably about a 6-month lag period. So we're beginning to shut down the shale oil production. Offshore oil can take 5 to 10 years to begin. And we are cutting back on oil companies globally are cutting back on their budgets to produce the long-lived, reliable, significant sources of oil. They're usually offshore, major onshore fields. So yeah, I mean, the market will probably be tightening in the next 2 to 3 quarters, but in a year or two, we'll probably be feeling the effect of the major CapEx cuts that virtually every company has announced by now.
And is it correct that once a well's taken offline, when it comes back online, whether offshore or in the shale patch, it's just not as productive or as effective once it's
Um,
taken offline? Is that
that's generally true, but that varies on the geology. For instance, if the Russians shut in their wells, their big problem is water. There's just so much water that runs into the well that you basically need to deal with a new one. The Saudi wells are very interesting geologically. They're almost like permanent gushers of oil. They're very stable. They are getting old. They are reaching the limits of their production capacity. If you shut a well in, you could lose the pressurization that drives the well for the recovery. So if you do shut the well in, you could lose pressurization and you might have to use expensive recovery techniques. And then there are other problems. If you have poorly maintained fields like Venezuela, God help you, you're never going to get it back. And in the US, it varies. Um, in general, you'll be losing some production capacity because you're shutting in. It just varies according to situations and the geology. And I'll stop there because I've been going on quite a bit.
So let me come back to one thing you said in your prepared remarks. It gets to this hypothesis that the U.S. shale and fracking industry is actually the love child of the Federal Reserve Bank.
No,
The
okay.
pushing of QE and artificially low interest rates really helped to facilitate this energy revolution that we've seen in the United States over the last decade. Can you address that, your view on that, and then to your question about lower interest rates, what that means for the shale industry? What's your view?
Yeah, this is a really interesting situation because the shale boom has come to us since the era of ultra low interest rates began. Certainly for the US, the era of QE began in 2008, 2009 after the banking crisis. So we do have unusually low interest rates, and we also have investors around the world who are simply hungry for yield. The Fed certainly provides a lot of liquidity to stocks to maintain stock valuations, but the reality is that we have pension funds and investors who need yield, who are willing to go places they wouldn't have gone before. And even if high yield debt um, seems to be a lot higher than 1%, 2%, even if it's 10, 15, uh, in a prior era when we had historical market interest rates, you would not have been able to finance shale development with relatively low interest loans. So there's a big criticism of the shale business model, which is that you have you know bondholders who get the guaranteed rate. You get a CEO who gets a big bonus if he's successful in increasing production, and unfortunately, the commodity risk is all with the equity shareholders. So that even though the bondholders make money, even though the CEOs get their bonuses, the shareholders have been wiped out again and again, especially in the context of the Saudi price war. So the shale miracle has been a miracle in a way, and yet it's also destroyed $1 trillion in capital investment because the low interest rates have enabled production far beyond the level of production that's consistent with getting an economic return on those assets. Or should I say, the low interest rates have enabled and facilitated relentless overproduction all the time. And that is one of the reasons why investors have begun to cut off capital to the oil patch. They're just not prepared to take this level of capital destruction anymore. And I'm simply saying we would not have seen this were we not in a QE type environment.
Great, thank you. Very important question. Do you think that the Fed's independence will be compromised as the mounting debt will pressure the Fed to keep interest rates low?
Well, in theory, yes. I mean, in theory, at some point there will be too much debt. But I give you the example of a country that is near and dear to my heart, Japan. Japan has piled up enormous amounts of debt, and I think they're probably pushing. I won't give you a number. Let's just say that their debt level is very much higher than ours, and I don't remember whether it's 200% yet or not, but it's high. But on the other hand, you've got an environment that has been characterized by deflationary tendencies, really ever since you could argue that deflation began at the end of the Cold War, because peace is deflationary, war is inflationary. The rise of China has been deflationary in that it's lowered cost bases for lots of things. The slowdown in China, in a way, is deflationary because the commodity push inflation that China helped drive is slowed. Japan is an aging society, so consumption is going down. A lot of people worry that Japan is in a deflationary spiral that they'll never break out of. But the point is, without um, bottlenecks, whether these are supply bottlenecks, labor supply bottlenecks, whatever bottlenecks that create inflation are, we seem to be out of those right now. So I think we'll probably be able to coast for a good long time as Japan has coasted, but sooner or later, the bill is going to come due. And whether there's some sort of global crisis or something like that, um, we've got to be prepared that at some point, this level of debt is unsustainable, in my opinion.
Great, thank you for that. Question here is, how far are we, or how close are we to introduction of fusion?
Ooh, I have no idea, except that I used to read articles about fusion in Scientific American when I was in high school. And when I went to Princeton University, the major center for fusion research was at the tokamak down the road. There's a guy named Ralph Izzo, got his PhD from Princeton. He is a nuclear engineer, and he is the CEO of PSEG, which is probably the company that is providing the GIC with its electricity to run this podcast today. So my good friend Ralph, not really a friend, I've met him a couple of times. Izzo talks about fusion once in a while, but the reality is that we don't see it anytime soon. On the other hand, we do see a tremendous range of other technologies. Costs for renewables are coming down. We haven't talked about natural gas becoming as cheap as it has. We haven't talked about the travails of the nuclear power industry. We haven't talked about advanced nukes. There are lots and lots of things that could happen right now. So I'm frankly not sure that a technology which requires enormously high upfront capital investment is really going to be practical when we can now have a modular approach to power, a distributed approach to power that uses everything from solar cells to fuel cells to microturbines to um, practically anything else.
Okay, thank you. Two remaining questions. Question here is regarding 5G. And could 5G be the next big infrastructure spend for the United States, similar to building the interstate highway system?
Well, it's certainly a lot of money. The public company in the United States with the highest capex budget is Verizon. If I'm not mistaken, they spend about $100 billion a year on capex, and most of that is on fiber and wireless infrastructure. So 5G will very definitely be a major source of infrastructure. Incidentally, also 5G is going to be a tremendous source of energy consumption too. Things driving energy consumption would be 5G deployment, many devices, high-powered devices using lots of power. The server farms that you would need to support the data flow to those devices will be an infrastructure in itself. Um, Electric vehicles will demand power. Artificial intelligence, actually, you wouldn't think of something that sounds ethereal, otherworldly, even disembodied like AI. But the reality is that AI uses enormous amounts of power. AI chips consume more power than other chips use. And AI is basically using data from giant server farms that, again, use enormous amounts of power. So, where does this get us? 5G will certainly drive telecommunications infrastructure. It will drive server infrastructure. It will drive more efficient supply chains. It will do a lot of things. So it's a very important infrastructure to build out. And yes, I mean, would you compare it to the federal highway system in precisely the same way? Um, one is physical infrastructure, the more is the other is a technological infrastructure. I wouldn't know how to compare them, but certainly it is. If you think about great waves of infrastructure across America, from the old ox carts to the canals to the railroads to the interstate highway system to aviation, then to the internet, to wireless, now to 5G. 5G will drive and enable the next wave of construction, absolutely.
Great. And our last question, if we assume that potential GDP is at or slightly below 2% in the United States, do you think energy spend will be in line or greater than that? And I would put this in both the fossil fuel energy, renewable energy, as well as electrical utilities.
Bill, I missed part of your question, and really all I heard you say was fossil fuel and electric utilities. Could you possibly repeat the question?
Sure, I'm sorry.
I missed the entire question, I'm afraid.
The premise is that U.S. potential GDP is about 2% or below 2%. And the question is the industries that you are focused on in terms of utilities and energy, will those grow in line with potential GDP or greater than potential GDP or GDP potential?
I'll start with electric power. Electric power historically has grown lockstep in tandem with GDP, and that was true of the entire history of the industry from Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Station in New York City until 2008. After 2008, that one-to-one correspondence broke down, and electric demand has been flat for quite some time. Really, what we're looking for is the next major catalyst for electricity, and I just named a few a minute ago. 5G, server farms, electric vehicles, and so forth. But one of the major issues facing the electric power industry, one of many issues, is that the capacity we built was designed for an economy that would be, or electric demand that would be growing a little faster. So we're a little overbuilt right now, but we'll be catching up. I'd expect electric utilities to probably largely grow in tandem and probably also get back to the track where they are moving in line with US GDP, given the drivers that we're seeing. Oil and gas is a slightly different question. At one point, oil and gas was 15% of the S&P 500. I forget the exact year. It's now down to about 2.5% of the S&P 500. So a lot of capital has moved out of that space, and much of that move in capital has to do with lower energy prices, pointing to lower profitability, and also just the capital destruction by the E&Ps that were able to access cheap debt financing, use that to facilitate excess production that drove prices down and denied the equity shareholders a return on capital. The direction of the oil and gas industry depends on future policy. But the reality is that demand for oil and gas is actually going to be growing. There's sort of a debate on when will we hit peak demand, when will demand start declining. We're seeing different types of demand. What's driving demand for oil and gas right now is not the automobile. In the BP forecast 2 or 3 weeks ago, BP said that even if you moved all light-duty vehicles to electric, you weren't going to limit oil demand. Instead, we're seeing airlines, we're seeing long-distance trucking in Asia, and of course, global shipping drive demand for jet fuel, for diesel fuel, and ultra low sulfur fuel for boats. Also, the plastics industry is a major driver of demand for petroleum. So even if we do phase out fossil fuels for automobiles or most transport in the US, there's still a lot of drivers there. So I really wouldn't have a good sense of whether this grows at the same rate of GDP or with the retransition out of oil over time, which we probably will. Obviously, it's a decades-long process. Um, with electric power, you have a stable infrastructure and a fairly stable function producing electricity. With oil, it's just different because we're moving away from oil for certain services, but we're still using lots of oil for other types of transportation and for petrochemicals. Um, and I guess I'll just leave it there.
Okay, that's great. Well, Jim, this has been very insightful and informative. Thank you very much for giving us a great insight into the utility space and what's happening inside the Beltway. Thank you all for participating and for answering the questions on the participant survey. As a reminder, this webinar will be replayed on the GIC's website, and that's www.interdependence.org. We're bringing this to the public as a public service. We are a nonprofit organization, a 501c3. If you're interested in making a donation to the GIC, more importantly, if you'd like to become a member of the GIC, take a look at on our website. You can find out about the benefits of becoming a member, and we really appreciate your attention today. Thank you all for participating, and we'll see you next time. Good afternoon.
Thank you.